everybody and welcome back to the channel. Now if you are watching this video live as it is dropped, happy Easter Sunday to you all. Today I'm really excited to be unveiling my review, my closer look at NECA's 7-inch scale Nosferatu figure. Now I'm a big fan of NECA, they do fantastic toys. I've done a lot of different videos on some of their content across the years on my channel, but I am a huge Nosferatu fan and I'm really pleased to finally have a figure in this scale of this caliber from this company. Of course, NECA have done a lot of horror figures across the years, and it's really nice to see them turn their attention to one of the first cinematic horror figures or characters in the form of Nosferatu. As ever, let's kick off by taking a look at the packaging, and of course this is in the standard NECA packaging. We can see this really interesting cover image actually, which is newly commissioned artwork illustrating Nosferatu himself. Kind of interesting them taking this approach. Of course there is no real film poster for them to reference, and that's usually what they put on the front of their horror figure boxes these days. But the image itself is quite nicely done. My only criticism of it is that maybe it's a little bit bland in terms of the colouring they've gone for. It is very heavy on the greys and the browns, but hey, this is a monochrome film, so I think they've done a fairly decent job with this. It looks really cool anyway, it's a really striking image, and it definitely is where they've been put on display. Now if we look at the side panel, they've opted for photos of the figures as standard. This is really cool, it's largely text free, and we have two very distinct looks for this figure, and it's entirely up to you. If you store your figure boxes on their side profile like this on the shelf, you have the option of displaying this whichever one takes your fancy. And then if we look at the back of the packaging, I'm particularly impressed with this. I actually say this is probably the more striking image, so if you're going to put this on display, then you've got a really good option here, because this looks great. There's a number of different photos sort of collaged together showing off all the different looks that you can create with this fantastic ultimate figure from NECA, and this looks really cool. This almost looks like a film poster itself, and again, largely text-free, which is really nice to put on display. And that's not all, because of course it is also a gatefold cover, so you can open it up like a book, and of course on the right hand side we have the window display showing the figure and all of his various accessories, and then on the left hand side we have this fantastic portrait of the figure in an action pose, which is really very cool. That's not all, because if we take the figure out of the packaging and look at the interior card art, the interior inlay behind the figure itself, we can see this fantastic photography NECA have produced of what looks to be the archway with the gate that we see in the film, which is a nice little extra piece there, a nice little bit of loving care and detail when it comes to the design of the packaging. The figure itself is very highly detailed, as you would expect from NECA, but I have to be honest, I was a little bit disappointed when it comes to the overall articulation, but we'll take a closer look at that in a little bit. Now in terms of the likeness, I think this head sculpt is really good. I think this is a pretty good approximation of what we see on screen from actor Max Schreck in his makeup here. If I had one criticism, it would be that maybe the forehead should be a little bit higher, but all in all I think this is a pretty sharp likeness. I think they've done a very nice job, and as you would expect from NECA, they've done really nice work with the overall paint apps as well, in terms of that detailing, that shading that really draws out some of the emphasis, particularly around the eyes. But you can see there's a lot of depth and texture here, which is really nicely done and really brings this figure to life, so to speak, no pun intended. Otherwise, the sculpting of the body and of course the detailing that we see here is very nicely done. I think one of the things that really holds this figure back though, unfortunately, is the fact that he is wearing this very long coat, which is of course entirely appropriate because that's what he does wear pretty much through the entirety of the film, but it does kind of limit what NECA could really do here in terms of the detailing, and also it will impact on the articulation, as we'll get to in a moment. Overall, I think it's nicely done, it's nicely sculpted, there's plenty of detail in here, and there are a number of paint washes to just give it a little bit more depth and texture, but there's still this feeling of it being a little bit bland and a little bit boring almost, and it's slightly disappointing as a visual overall. Now when we look at his hands, and of course he does come with quite a few which we'll take a closer look at soon, these are very nicely painted, much like the skin tone that we see on the head. It is very consistent there. We see a slightly purpley greyish kind of quality to the hands, which look really good. It gives it a bit more life and energy, which is interesting, and of course we can see those long nails as well, which is really effective and nicely sculpted there. When we look at the legs, again, these are a little bit bland, unfortunately, and the shoes. There's some detailing here, which is nice, and there is some paint washes, but overall, it still has that feeling of being just a little bit of a drab look, unfortunately. The articulation, then, we do have a ball joint at the top of the neck and a ball joint at the bottom of the neck, so you can get plenty of movement out of this, which is really nice to see. So he can spin his head from side to side, no problem. He can lean it left and right, which is nice to see, and he can also bend his head down a really good distance, but it won't go back because of the restriction in that collar there, so that's as far as you're going to get it, I'm afraid. Now he does have ball joints in the shoulders, so he can lift his arms up to a healthy distance and he can spin them round as well. Sadly, he just have a pin swivel at the elbow. That lower forearm will spin all the way around, which is great, and then it will hinge to a just past 90 degrees actually. So you can get a pretty decent range out of this, but it would have been nice if this had maybe been a double joint to really get the hand all the way back there. Speaking of the hand, there's a pin swivel there at the wrist, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and of course hinge forwards and backwards with no restrictions here, which is really, really good. Sadly, things take a downturn when it comes to the torso articulation. It's really difficult to know how much is coming from the legs here and how much is coming from the waist. I think there is articulation in the waist, allowing him to move from side to side and maybe bend forwards and backwards, but really this is really very, very, very minimal indeed. Likewise, the same goes for the legs, because of course there are ball joints in the hips allowing the legs to kick out to the side and technically kick forwards and backwards, but this coat effect that he has is very, very restrictive, so you're not really going to get an awful lot of motion out of this. Now his legs will hinge to about 90 degrees and they will swivel because it is a pin swivel here as well, but again this feels a little bit limiting. And then if we look at the ankle, there is an ankle pivot here that will allow the foot to move forwards and backwards on a hinge slightly, and it will pivot from side to side, but again, not a huge range of motion, which is disappointing. But it's not all doom and gloom, because things do take a massive upswing when we look at the accessories, because he comes with no less than 3 additional pairs of hands, various gripping and claw hands, which look very, very cool indeed. 2 alternate heads with 2 very different, very distinct looks. His hat, a handwritten note, a set of keys, and then this array of writing equipment, including a quill and a inkwell, which is pretty cool indeed. Now, there is plenty to be going on with here in terms of creating all sorts of interesting different looks and distinct poses and different feelings for this one figure. So I have to give NECA top marks for this, because they have given us so many different props to create just very different atmospheres in terms of our displays and our dioramas with this one figure, which I have to commend them for. I think is a really good effort. I think there's a lot of different looks we can create with them. I'm really, really grateful, particularly for the keys. I think they're very nice, actually on a chain themselves, which look really, really cool. It looks really authentic and realistic. Likewise, having the quill and the handwritten note, I think is a really cool piece, and the addition of the hat there is really quite striking. Plus, of course, we have 3 heads in total, which is actually quite interesting. So you can create different tones with the expression that he has on his face. Some are slightly more comedic, some are much more leaning into the horrific element appropriately. So I actually really like this. I think we've got a pretty decent array of extras here to make this a really interesting and diverse figure for our displays, which is wonderful. Overall, I have to say, I do really like this figure. It's one that I've, a character I have much love for, and one I was really anticipating getting hold of this year. If I'm completely honest, I'm a little bit disappointed because there's something a little bit stiff and a bit bland about it when it's on display. That's partly, well, it's really a combination between the colouring of the figure, which is, very heavy on the browns and blacks and greys, which doesn't make it the most visually appealing figure when it's on your shelf. The other problem, I think, is obviously the restriction when it comes to that coat that he's got there, that really restricts you from creating a lot of dynamic poses that might have been more interesting. Now, of course, the figure himself, the character himself in the film, is very stiff, so I think that is probably appropriate and probably doesn't hurt it too much. He's not a really flexible character in the movie. He is very stiff and very awkward moving. That's part of the uncanny element to his portrayal. So I think it's fine, but as a figure, it just feels a little bit blocky, I suppose, and a little bit stiff, which is slightly disappointing. But nevertheless, a very nice entry from NECA, and I have to say I'm very happy with it. It's definitely one I'm going to keep on the shelf for a while. I think he's got a really cool, striking visual look. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.